Everybody, please take your seats. We're going to start the third panel. And you're motivated to sit down because lunch is after the third panel. So we don't want to be late. Come in, sit down. Sorry to end your conversations. You can talk again at lunch. There'll be lots of good time for that. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for coming back. Good to see you all. I'm Letitia Grenier, the new director of the Water Policy Center for PPIC, and I'm really excited to have this next conversation. We're going to be talking about how we're looking at the changing futures of water for the state of California from a bunch of different perspectives. So I'd like to introduce my panelists here. I'm going to start in the middle with Nancy Vogel, who is the Deputy Secretary of Water for the California Natural Resources Agency. She's been deeply involved in state planning for water supply and water resilience and the voluntary agreements, among many other things. So she can probably answer all of your questions, just like my other two panelists. On the far end here is Kaylee Allen, Senior Advisor for Regional U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She is a legal expert on endangered species and water law, and also can help us learn about the federal and interagency processes for the new biological opinions that should be coming out soon or in process, and was going to help with questions on habitat and wildlife populations. And right next to me here is Jennifer Pierre, General Manager for the State Water Contractors, a very large agency that covers the entire state from north to south, rural to urban. And so across these women, we have decades of experience and really deep understanding of California water and water systems. So excited to talk with them. And I'm going to start with you, Nancy. Can you tell us a little about what is the state's plan for water? We've been hearing about surface water storage, groundwater storage, big infrastructure, small infrastructure. What should we expect?
So is this working? Okay, great. Thank you. To answer that question, Letitia, I want to start with some context, and I'm going to quote PPIC. So here's a quote from Stewarding the Wet Years, your policy brief that you just put out, I guess last month. Quote, integrating wet and dry year management will require a multi-decade infrastructure investment program that focuses on conveying water to recharge sites, improving flood defenses, and integrating nature-based solutions where appropriate. That's it. That's the state's plan. That is the through line through the water resilience portfolio, the water supply strategy, the California Water Plan Update 2023, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, the DWR Strategic Plan, all of those plans that we produced between 2020 and 2023, that PPIC quote, I think, captures where we're trying to go. That's what we're working towards. And so thank you, PPIC, for acknowledging that it's going to take a long time. And I'm looking at you, Jeff. So we all know, because we live it, that progress in California water policy moves incrementally and it's iterative. But occasionally there are big lurches, and I think we just had a big lurch this past winter where we really pushed forward. You had 3 years of good budget cycles from the state with investments of nearly $9 billion, and then compressed in that same 3 years, this incredible flip from extreme drought to extreme precipitation, which I think spurred a lot of creativity and hustle on the part of folks in state agencies. And as one atmospheric river after another was barreling into California, you had really hard-working folks at DWR, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the State Water Resources Control Board, doing what they could to help local agencies recharge, maximize recharge. And they hit the ground running in part because in August 2022, a very dry month and a very dry year, the governor's water supply strategy told them, hey, get together and start figuring out how you're going to streamline recharge permitting, among other things. And that document also set a target for the state to achieve a 500,000 acre feet of water on average each year for groundwater recharge. So some of the things that the agencies did as a result of the chaos of last winter is they streamlined processes for permitting, as you all heard earlier today. Under the governor's executive orders alone, 400,000 acre feet of water was recharged. They used at DWR, they used really old-fashioned telephone trees to just connect flood managers with folks who were in positions to take water for recharge, and then they listened carefully to what those water district leaders were telling them that they needed, and they established they established a temporary pump program where they made sure that pumps were available to folks who needed them to divert more extra water, flood waters. 16,000 acre feet in the Tulare Lake Basin was diverted with those pumps, and then they also established a rip and chip program in which they got the heavy equipment. They helped locals get the heavy equipment that they needed to rip out vines and trees so that they could quickly turn orchards and vineyards into recharge basins. And we tried to target those into places where that would also help domestic wells and also divert floodwaters away from communities. So my answer, I guess, Letitia, in brief, is that we're going to do all that and then more coming up. And some of the things that we need to work on, you heard about it already this morning on the other panels, but I'm going to just tick through this really fast, things that we got to work on. We have to tighten the coordination between reservoir operators and the folks doing the recharge. We have to lean on watershed scale planning. The update to the California Water Plan 2023 emphasizes this, and we need it to advance flood MAR and flood, which is flood managed aquifer recharge. We need that so we can see the inevitable trade-offs within a watershed for various management scenarios. And related to that, we need to site and size and build conveyance so we can get water to where we can recharge. We need landowners and local agencies to be ready to take that water and to sink it underground. We have to understand where recharge can boost water levels under domestic wells. And we need to know, and this goes to Gary Bobker's question earlier, we need to know the timing and the volume of stream flows that provide the greatest ecological benefit, and that's the kind of information we can get through the California Environmental Flows Framework, and that's the kind of information that I think should provide some confidence to the folks who have to permit recharge, right? To make sure that they're not causing environmental damage. And we need to store water for the environment, Jeff, yes. We need, as Jeff always says, it's a three-legged stool: water for farms, water for cities, water for the environment. I think that the water supply investment projects that the Water Commission is keeping track of, that will help. There will be assets, flow, and storage assets in those 7 projects that the state can manage, but I think the voluntary agreements will also further that discussion. And then we need to track recharge. DWR is starting to do this systematically in coordination with the water board. It's going to take time, but eventually that tracking will become part of Bulletin 118, which is the state's groundwater data compendium. And finally, and then I'll shut up, the legislature and the governor recently enacted SB 659, which is a law that says, hey, DWR, go out and create a groundwater recharge action plan with actionable recommendations. And DWR will be doing that and trying to build that work into the water plan update. And I think that gives us an opportunity to put forth more recharge policies that can better protect communities and the environment.
That's great to hear. Hopefully, next time we get a big winter, we'll be more ready and we'll do even more. I'd like to move on now to Jennifer. From the state water contractor point of view, I'd be interested to hear what you think about some of the state's plan around integrating water management across wet and dry years. What are the policy changes that you think are needed, and what are the biggest environmental justice issues on your mind?
Thank you. Kind of following up on Lance's point, we did do a lot last year, and I'm really proud of that, and I don't even think we've got our totals yet, but I know, for example, in Kern County Water Agency's area, over 1 million acre feet were put in the ground. I mean, that's more than a full Folsom Lake of surface water storage being stored underground, and that's a huge deal. So there were definitely people ready. In the State Water Project Service area, we have a number of adjudicated groundwater basins, so we can kind of operate outside of, I'll just say Sigma. I'm not going to describe it anymore with any adjectives. But we have, Coachella Valley, we have the Antelope Valley, we've got Mojave desert area, and so we do, and we've got the Kern Water Bank, and so there's a number of places where we can put state water project water, and a lot of that was done, and I agree we could do more in the future, and I think that's what we need to focus on. And it's been interesting to me to see the evolution of our members, which is 27 public water agencies throughout the state, really focused, I think, only on conveyance, because we are still trying to build the Delta Conveyance Project, and really recognize that in 2017, 2019, 2023, we are leaving water on the table. And this isn't water, in our opinion, that otherwise would have environmental benefits. We're talking about 100,000 CFS moving under the Golden Gate Bridge and not really being able to, fully exercise our full water right because we aren't able to put it somewhere. So I think it's been a really good, 2023 has been good in that way to really make clear that people do need to make those investments, that we can't just rely on the San Luis Reservoir for our storage. A number of our agencies do have storage, but a number do not, other than San Luis Reservoir. And I think what's happening now is we're coming together as a group and saying what makes the most sense. So a couple, things that I think can happen and that should be happening are partnerships. So I think we're seeing a lot more of that among the contractors, but I think there's more to be done between the state contractors and other ag districts, other urban areas, really figuring out how to better integrate the existing infrastructure and perhaps a little bit of new infrastructure to better store and plan for that. One of the things that I'll point out is that, and one thing that I think we all learned together is that earlier allocations matter. We definitely don't ever want to be in a position where the department is allocating water that really can't be delivered. And, we saw that rollback happen in 2021, I believe, or two. But I think that when we have such dynamic hydrology, I'm not sure we can do 30-day allocations. I think we need to look at, are there abilities to run studies and start to allocate earlier? A lot of our members, I think Ellen ran through kind of what the hydrology looked like, and big January, dry February, then we got wet again. And, during the January, February, March timeframe, many of our water agencies were trying to figure out, are we putting water in storage or are we taking water out? And that, how they operated their systems was a big question mark. And I think it was paralyzing in some regards to our water agencies. So having an ability to, be more nimble in how we're planning our allocation on the State Water Project could have gone a long way. To that end, the Delta Conveyance Project, had that been in place, that would have delivered a lot more water in that January timeframe. I think making more clear what the overall allocation could have been. So even though we did land at 100% allocation, having the tunnel in place would have allowed us to have more certainty around the year's allocation in a way that would have allowed not just ag, but really urban, we're learning to plan for that. I think we've, in 2019, the state contractors and DWR signed what's called a Water Management Tools Amendment to our water supply contracts, which really, I think, modernized our ability to better marry supply and demand of state water project water amongst our contractors. So how they transfer water amongst themselves, how they exchange water amongst themselves, how they use existing facilities to move and manage water. Those tools were incredibly useful in this year because, as Lance was saying, everyone's calling each other, can you take this water? Can you take this water? And I think the timing of what people had available and their infrastructure and when they could take it, really helpful. I think in my mind now there's an open question. Is there more that we can do? And how does that then also relate to non-state project contractors? How do we share with the CVP or even within areas that are not on the system? And does it make sense about talking about place of use? And are we artificially prohibiting our ability to move water into underground storage because of some of the rules we have about where it can be put and how it can be used? I'm certainly not recommending a wild, wild west, but I think that there's I think it would be wise for us to take a look at some of those restrictions to find out if they're artificially restricting our ability to do that. The other thing I just want to point out in terms of policy is that, we are very focused on water year types. In fact, even the opening slide was, wet years. But even in really, really dry years, we have big storms and we have the ability to move and store water and put it away even for maybe use later that year. So I think that's, an evolution among the water community to not, we don't have average years and we also don't have, average conditions within a water year. So we need to figure out how to be responsive within a water year. And then lastly, I just want to speak quickly on a policy issue that we're really focused on related to underground storage, and that is what are the guidelines around the movement of water into groundwater basins. And we are supportive of SB 122, which was the bill that allows basically no permitting for groundwater recharge, and completely agree that's great, good policy. But the issue that we have is that excess water is our water right, and so defining what excess means is going to be critical to making sure that that bill doesn't infringe on the water rights system. So we're very interested in making sure that as that rolls out and is implemented, we're making sure there really is excess water in the system so that we're able to satisfy our water right, and then those that are able to take for groundwater recharge can do that once our water right's satisfied. So that's something that you'll be hearing from the state contractors and probably the CVP contractors as well of a modification we want to make. So those are some of the policy adjustments I would recommend.
Thank you. I really appreciate that call for more nimbleness and flexibility, which seems like what we need to be dealing with, what aren't really water years anymore, as you point out, but water months or water weeks. It's changing much more rapidly. Kaylee, I want to move on to you. So when we think about these wet years, it's the time when our aquatic wildlife can recover from the difficulties they've had during the drought years and because of landscape modification. It's when they need to have their big booms to be able to deal with the busts they've had in between. Tell us what's going on with habitat, so that habitat that would get activated by water. What's the big news? What are the highest priority items? Are we going to see any exciting fish on floodplains or other hopeful things like that in the near future?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thanks to PPIC for holding this forum. I think there is a lot going on, and everything moves slowly also. So right now, I think there's exciting efforts in terms of floodplains. There's been a lot of energy there, particularly in the Sacramento Valley, about how we utilize our floodplains better for habitat, for other purposes, obviously. One of the things we've been, working with partners on is, can these floodplains support both fins and feathers, fish and birds? Many of our national wildlife refuges in the Sacramento Valley were created for the purpose of supporting migratory waterfowl, and so can we utilize those refuge lands to do more than just that, but also staying true to that original purpose for which they were created? So that's an area that we've been putting a lot of effort into, and a lot of people have, and so certainly not just us. This year, we've seen the fishing season closed off of California, and there are a lot of folks that are really, concerned about loss of their livelihoods. And so we've been working with groups in the Sacramento Valley in particular around what we might be able to do to support salmon runs in the valley. We have the Coleman National Fish Hatchery that produces on average 12 million fall run a year, fall run Chinook salmon. We've been doing some studies releasing fry into the Sacramento River. Unfortunately, our returns are horrible this year. We've just closed our spawning season, and we are somewhere in the 7 to 9 million fish of eggs produced, and several, or at least my understanding is that a lot of those eggs are of poor quality. So, which is, not what we wanted to hear. We've been talking to folks about the possibility of doing some of those rice field experiments, but I don't know if they can happen this year, given what we've seen. We're hoping that the state's fall run collection tends to be a little bit later than ours at their hatcheries, so hopefully they'll do better than we did, but we'll see. And those are the types of things that we can't, it's like water in that we can't really predict what's going to happen on any given year, what kind of returns that we'll see. Another area that I think is really exciting, although less tied to the big boom years, is some of the agricultural land repurposing work that's going on. Thinking about with Sigma and with other things that may cause some agricultural lands to go out of production. can that be used for habitat for species like monarchs or other pollinator species? It's a lot of land that we are potentially talking about, and what can we do to utilize those lands so that we can focus more water in the areas where it can really be used, and maybe take those more marginalized areas out of production, but still support species and habitat. I guess the other thing I wanted to point out is we're always trying to do more, but we've also had a lot of successes, and I think we should be we should be celebrating those things that we've done. Actually, today there's a ceremony up at on the Yuba River on the Hallwood project that's been going on for 5 years, and it's completed of floodplain work up there. And so, we need to take credit where credit is due. I mean, there's a lot to do, but there's a lot getting done also, and I think recognizing those successes that we're having keeps us motivated for working more. One last thing I'll say is, I'm sure you've all seen those spaghetti maps of the governance in the water world, and all the different agencies that are involved, as Ara was pointing out. And I feel like coordination amongst ourselves is really the key point. I tend to focus a lot in my job on the how we do our work, not just the what we're doing. And I do feel like coordination is one of those areas where we do get the bang for our buck when we really invest in developing relationships and working together. One of the big successes we've seen is in the Bay Area. The Bay Area counties passed a bond measure a few years back now to do projects related to sea level rise, restoration, and recreation. And we put together a team of biologists, engineers, and others that meet on a very regular basis to work through all the regulatory issues that are associated with those projects. And we're seeing great success in moving projects faster. But we couldn't do that without the coordination that we have. For those of you who've done work in the Bay Area, there's a lot of regulatory agencies involved. And it's important that we're all talking to each other and understanding each other's needs and the way our laws and policies work, so that we can make them work better together rather than fight about who goes first or who goes last is really more. So I think those are some areas where we need to continue to put in the time and effort in developing those relationships and figuring out how the agencies can work better together.
Thank you for that. I'm definitely hearing this theme across all of the panels, that working together in new ways is part of what we all need to do to deal with the new situation we find ourselves in terms of the climate. And a shout out to the Bay, I'm going to get it wrong, Bay Regional Restoration Integration Team. I think BRIT is the name of the program you were just talking about. I might have got the acronym a little wrong. But and that was half paid for by taxpayers through that bond measure, and then the agencies put up the other half of the money to do that permit streamlining process. So it's a good model of a new way to get things done. So thanks for bringing that up. And that's a nice segue into our next question, which is going to be about funding and permitting. So as we all know, there's been a lot of federal money out there lately to be had, with the states competing for it through the bill and also the IRA. So how are we doing? Because we know that California, because of our very complex regulatory structure and sort of overlapping jurisdictions, can have a tough time competing for that kind of money if there aren't projects that have already gotten through all the regulatory hurdles and are shovel ready. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what's going on with permitting and funding for the kind of work that we know needs to happen. And I'm going to start with you again, Nancy. How is the state doing with that federal money and other permitting and funding questions?
So federal money is starting to flow. In July, the Bureau of Reclamation gave, it was $10 million for the San Luis and the Los Vaqueros reservoir expansion projects, $30 million for sites. There was $28 million from NOAA Fisheries recently for coho salmon on the Central Coast. I'm just tossing out a few examples here. And then I think it was like $315 million from the Bureau of Reclamation this fall for different water reuse projects, 20. Most of that money went to California. So it's a huge amount of money. I don't have a tally on exactly how much it is, how much California has applied for, and how much has arrived in California. I don't know that. But in each federal agency, you'd know better than I do, Kaylee, but each federal agency is handling the granting of those funds in a different way. It's a huge job to get that money out the door quickly and responsibly. But we're hopeful. I think altogether, the Bureau of Reclamation has something like $8 billion that it can spend now on water resilience projects, and we're hoping a lot more money comes to California. We are in line with the Biden administration in terms of our priorities for how those funds ought to be spent: water recycling, groundwater recharge, aquatic habitat restoration, et cetera. We're also in alignment with the Biden administration in terms of using those dollars for natural infrastructure where possible, not just built infrastructure, and making sure that 40% of the benefits go to environmental justice communities. So, I'm hopeful that there will be more money. As for permitting, the governor in July and the legislature enacted a streamlined permit streamlining package, and I won't bore you talking about the sites process because Ali talked about that on a previous panel, but the governor certified the first water project for CEQA judicial review, streamlining under SB 149, one of the bills in that package, and that was for Sites Reservoir. I don't know whether that streamlining package will help us pull down more federal dollars. I think that streamlining package needed to happen regardless. It's a little too early to tell whether it helps with the federal dollars, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. We'll keep our eye on that process and see how that one goes in particular. Kaylee, I want to move on to you now. So there's been an interagency process working on the new biological opinions, and you and your team have been involved in that. We're curious to hear an update on that. How are things going? Should we expect big changes or any surprises? And then also, how does that process knit together with some of the other regulatory processes, many things moving at the same time, with the state water board's water quality control plans / voluntary agreements?
All right, just a little bit there. And actually, before I go there, I wanted to comment a little bit on the federal funding piece. So actually, this morning, the Biden administration announced the America the Beautiful grants. And I think state of California got a little over $6 million in that, including a project on the Feather River with Sunset Weir. It's going to DWR. Yeah. Yeah.
That's good.
And then there's 3 tribal projects spread out throughout California. So the money is coming. It is coming slow. I was telling folks that I've been pretty heavily involved in the fish passage money that's coming through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is minimal compared to what Reclamation and others are getting. But that first round of fish passage money that we got, we literally had a week to put projects forward. So if projects weren't ready to go, they were not on the list. And so I think there is importance in getting those projects ready to go. Both because you never know when funding's going to come available. You also never know when those big lurches are going to happen, where we have the right sort of mix of state and federal administration support for things and the crisis of the moment that we can use to help push things forward. In terms of the biological opinion, so where we're at is Reclamation just provided the consulting agencies, which are Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS on the federal side, biological assessment, and that's the process under the Endangered Species Act, Section 7 regulations. They provide a biological assessment that outlines their proposed action, what they intend to do, and what they think the effects of that action are. And we just got that last week. So, and with that biological assessment, that triggers what we call formal consultation. So we are in the process, and I should add that DWR is an applicant under Section 7, but is also moving forward under the state California ESA regulations to issue ultimately an incidental take permit to DWR. And so the 6 agencies, and those 6 agencies are U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NIMS and Reclamation on the federal side, DWR, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the State Water Resources Control Board on the state side have been working together for a really long time to put together, a proposed action that we think will meet species needs, meet water users' needs, meet California's needs, sort of writ large in the operations of the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. So now that we have that biological assessment, we'll be reviewing it to make sure that we understand all the pieces that are in it. We tend to have a lot of back and forth at the beginning of a consultation to understand the project, make sure we're understanding the words on the page and that we understand it the same way that the action agency does, in this case reclamation, so that there's no questions there. And then we'll take the information they've provided and ultimately we'll issue a biological opinion determining whether the species that they're consulting on are jeopardized by a project or designated critical habitat, so I'm getting really nerdy, is adversely modified. Hopefully that won't be the case here. So generally, oftentimes people will say something, that the biological opinion dictates something or another, and generally they don't. They just say, yes, you action agency who proposed this project, we think this will not jeopardize species. And it may have some, reasonable and prudent measures about how things get implemented to limit impacts to species, but we're not generally saying you can or cannot go forward with an action. So ultimately, this consultation, because it is so high profile and there's so much interest, will do peer review on our draft biological opinion. Folks will get a chance to review that at some point. I don't have a schedule yet, since we don't fully know what's in the document that we just got. But certainly the hope is that we'll be able to wrap up this project in this next calendar year, both with new biological opinions, a new incidental take permit, and ultimately reclamation will need to issue a record of decision under NEPA to be able to implement all of that. So that's sort of where that stands.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting to hear all the details of that. It makes you, it just sort of brings home the point of how complicated the process is and explains why it takes quite a bit of time and a lot of coordination. Jennifer, I want to go to you now. So the State Water Board's Water Quality Control Plan /VAs is in process, and I know that you have some thoughts on how that will impact regulatory stability in the Delta, and I'd love to hear about that, and also why does that matter so much?
Yeah, and can I follow up too on permitting and funding, because the voluntary agreement really is, in my mind, a mechanism to streamline those things. So we just heard, that having kind of everybody thinking about what, being aligned around what funding is needed and what we're doing and what we're trying to accomplish, and really the voluntary agreement as proposed by the Newsom administration, along with a number of public water agencies that represent over 90% of the watersheds in the state, are really trying to align how we make decisions, how we prioritize funding, what habitat projects we build, how we coordinate environmental water flows throughout the system with each other to also essentially culminate in the Delta as Delta outflow, which is the state board's one of their main objectives in updating the water quality control plan. So, and luckily, the biological assessment and the IT incidental take permit applications that were recently submitted to the fish agencies both incorporate the implementation of the voluntary agreement. So the voluntary agreement proposal for the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project are the proposals from Bureau and DWR for how they intend to operate the projects, among other things. And that's really helpful because as the board, State Water Board, proceeds with their evaluation of alternatives, including the voluntary agreement, we're hopeful that they will select the voluntary agreement and that we will then have Endangered Species Act permits that allow us to implement it. The State Water Board started the update to the Water Quality Control Plan, I believe it was 2009. And it's been a really long time. And I think if there is one thing we all agree on is that it needs to get done. And that's not to point fingers. It's a complicated process. I think the board's been clear. They've been distracted multiple times by the drought. They've been, I think, gracious to let us put together an alternative for their consideration. And now what they have before them is a number of alternatives, including the voluntary agreement, which we believe is the most stabilizing alternative that the board can consider. And part of that is because it is voluntary, and that water agencies are voluntarily providing water and funding and implementing habitat and using a governance forum within the voluntary agreement structure to have the dialogue about how to prioritize the funding, how to prioritize what habitat projects get done, how we might coordinate flow, like I was saying before. The Water Quality Control Plan in the Delta is kind of like the foundation on which everything else is built. So it's really challenging to talk about what is, for example, excess flow for purposes of groundwater recharge if you don't really know what your regulatory kind of requirement is. Likewise, I don't know what my operational criteria are going to be on a Delta conveyance project if I don't really know what the underlying Delta regulations are. Same, I would say, for Sites Reservoir, or really anything big or small that we're trying to do that relies on the Delta watershed. We really need the board's regulation around what are the in-stream flow and outflow requirements, what habitat projects are we doing. So I think it's really critical that the board do this work. We're very glad that it has gotten to this point. We'll be very engaged with the comment period, and we are very excited that we do have a program that I think allows us to more nimbly have discussions about trade-offs, not just between consumptive use and environmental use, but really, storage for cold water pool versus outflow. I think that is becoming a more frequent question that resource agencies are having to ask ourselves. So even at a 5% or 0% allocation, there's still trade-offs that need to have a dialogue, and we're going to see more and more of that. And we're not just going to see it in certain year types. It's going to be month to month, like we actually even saw in 23, moving from January to February with a change petition back to wet. So I'm really excited about the voluntary agreement and the governance structure it sets up to create that nimbleness in a structured environment that's permitted and allows us to have the dialogue and build the trust. I think that came up earlier on a panel. There is no trust in the Delta watershed. I think we do need to work on that, and we need to bring all parties in. And I will once again say that the table and door are still open for all parties to participate with us on the voluntary agreement. And we hope that will help us to create more stability in decision making, even as we deal with the volatility of the hydrology.
Yeah, thank you. It's going to be an exciting time next couple of years. See what happens. While we're, exciting in a good way, hopefully. While we're on the VAs just for a moment, I'd just like to hear from you, Nancy, about the VAs in wet years. Are they relevant? How do those two things interact? Because we tend to think of it as a limitation during dry years.
No, they are relevant. It is not business as usual under the VAs in the wet years. It's true that most of the flow assets that are in the voluntary agreements are targeted to the drier years because that's where the scientists tell us those flows are most beneficial to fish and wildlife. But in the wet years, you've got habitat assets as well that are going to be built under the voluntary agreements, like in the range of 45,000 acres. And habitat's there year in and year out, whatever the flows are. And the state board has put it far more articulately than I can at this moment. But essentially a more natural flow regime coupled with the physical structure of habitat is far better. That's better for fish, native species, than just one or just the other. So the VAs do couple that together. So I think even in the wet years, the habitat that you'll see constructed on the floodplains, there's rearing and spawning habitat, and there's fish food production that will be generated under the voluntary agreements. All of that will help in the wet years too. And then in addition to that, don't forget, as Jennifer just mentioned, there's a big science and governance aspect to the voluntary agreements where you have the state and federal agencies and a multitude of water districts coming together and coordinating operations, and it's their goal to try to maximize the ecological benefits under the voluntary agreements. There's an 8-year window where we've got to make a difference, and so I think in a wet year that coordination that will be established under the governance and the science of the VAs will also help to maximize the ecological benefits in the wet years.
Yeah, just one sec. But I think it's great to point out that there's that really strong incentive to use those wet years right at the beginning of the process to meet that 8-year deadline. Please go ahead, Jennifer.
I just wanted to add, I think that one of my overarching objectives over time is to maximize the wet year benefit of supply, and we've been talking about that all morning. That really allows those that rely on the Delta to take some pressure off the Delta in the drier conditions. And I think just as an overall policy, that creates climate resiliency for our water agencies, and it also creates, I think, resiliency for the ecosystem. So I don't think we can turn the switch right now. We need a lot more infrastructure and operational rules and an ability to really fully implement that. But the proposal in the wet years with the voluntary agreement, as Nancy said, is protective of those kind of landscape water interactions that will occur because there will be water on the landscapes that we are opening up and making available to them, but also to, I think, incentivize and motivate water agencies to really, really, even more so than we did in 23, take advantage of those wet years so that we don't have dry year emergencies, and we can, again, take a little pressure off the system from the water, the water user agencies. And I think that was a really important aspect of how we put together the voluntary agreement proposal, which we're now calling Healthy Rivers California.
Please, Kaylee.
Jump in for just 1 second. In terms of, and nice plug there. In terms of taking the pressure off, I mean, I think one of the other things we need to continue to do is look at those. Look at tributaries and other, sort of non-project type areas. So one of the places that a lot of agencies have been heavily involved for years is Battle Creek. Battle Creek is a really important place where we could establish a second population of winter run salmon, Chinook salmon, and we've been working hard to do that. And by taking the pressure off, a little of the pressure off the Sacramento River operations, Shasta operations. I think, looking at those places where we can establish new populations to help take the pressure off the basic system would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, another way to have resilience is that redundancy. Excellent. So we've got about 3 minutes left. So that means for our last question, each of you get 1 minute to tell us about what's the thing that you're most excited about. Is there a new innovation or change? And how can we make more of that? And I'll start with you, Kaylee.
All right, so I guess in the last couple of years, I've seen a couple of things happening that I am excited about and would like to see more of. The first is I feel like we in the water community are a little bit more inclusive than we've been in the past. We still have a long way to go, trust me. But I think from the Department of the Interior standpoint, Secretary Holland has made a big push in tribal relations, and that's been I feel like I can see the difference in that in the 25 years that I've been involved in California water issues. And I'm excited for that, and I think we really, really need to lean into that. As Jennifer said, the table's open. We need to make the table bigger, and we need to make sure that we are hearing from everyone. And I really appreciated Nahal's comments this morning around that. The second thing I have seen, particularly over just this last drought period, I feel like there's an openness and a willingness to look at things differently, be it water operations, the way we're working together. I think the big lurch you were talking about, I really see some things have shaken loose in a way that I haven't seen before, and some of that should be reflected in the biological assessment that Reclamation just put out, and the way that Reclamation's proposing to operate the system. But I think just thinking about how do we do things differently than we have? We don't have the system we had 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And what does that mean? And how do we work together to make those changes?
Yeah, Thank you. Same question to you, Nancy.
Okay, so I'm one of those people who ascribes to the belief that you can track California, no, that some historian someday, some poor historian is going to track California water policy by looking at the themes for the Aqua and PPIC conferences, you know, the annual conferences, right? And they're going to say, oh yeah, you can see where they were going. And so I look at today, and it's stewarding the wet years, and to me it feels like, look, we just entered an era of fusion, right, where we're not managing for wet years or dry years, but extreme weather, and that's a good thing, and that gives me hope. And I also, like Kaylee, I sense a lot of people being willing to do things they wouldn't have before. And things are shaking loose, and people were partnering up in ways they might not have before. And I think you tapped into this this zeitgeist with today, and that makes me very hopeful that we'll have 1,000 decisions that happen over the coming year, from the individual landowner to the Secretary of the Interior, that combine to expand our capacity to deal with the wet and the dry years.
Love those words of hope. Last word from you, Jennifer.
Yeah, speaking of hope, I don't think you can work in water if you're not optimistic, and I am an optimistic person, but I am really optimistic right now. I feel so hopeful about the fact that we're looking at the voluntary agreement and the biological assessments and the ITP, and that our regulatory agencies have really come together to try to put something, as Kaylee said, that protects the environment, meets the requirements, and also, I think, advances water supply reliability. I'm really excited about the water that got stored this year. I just cited the 1 million acre feet in the Kern Water Bank area, but I just think there's way more out there, and it's just really, really hopeful to see that, and that excites me, and I think it incentivizes people to do more. And then lastly, I'm really excited about the storage and partnerships the discussions that are happening. So even though I think there's more we can do, the fact that people are actually talking about it, trying to be creative, figuring it out, and I think, all those things really come down to people being in a problem-solving mode and working collaboratively, and seeing that happening in all of these different forums gives me hope and I'm excited about.
Yeah, thank you. If there's one good thing that comes out of our crazy weather and big events, is that we do start to work together more and innovate. All right, so now we get to turn it over to you, our audience. If you're in person, raise your hand. Someone will come bring you a microphone. If you're online, send an email to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. I think we have someone right in the middle here.
Thank you. Hi. So I believe you guys did mention a little bit about the salvation species in California, but I wanted to know, with what happened earlier this year with PG&E in Butte Creek, the contamination that is happening right now with salmon and trout in California, what's a good way to, I believe, enforce laws or enforce actions to prevent this from happening in California again, considering that obviously California and also the Endangered Species Act are, oh my God, what's the word for? They exist, we know they exist, but how can we make sure companies or individuals would just not contaminate? And if we can't enforce anything, what can be enforced to save the habitat of these species?
Thank you. Anyone want to take that one?
Both look at me.
Great, Kaylee.
I mean, I think, obviously we have the Endangered Species Act. It does allow for, or there are provisions for enforcement. The specific instance on Butte Creek would involve species that my agency doesn't regulate, so I'm not sure exactly where that stands. But I do think, laws, I feel like, are both useful tools, and they're not the only solution. So how do we both, how do we use the regulatory tools at our disposal, but also, to me, partnerships, working together and working to understand where the potential concerns are in the systems that we have, and how can we work together. I mean, we work collaboratively with PG&E in many areas. How can we help folks do better? Like encourage both through regulatory and non-regulatory means to do better. I mean, that's not a great answer to your question, but I mean, there are tools to enforce our environmental laws. It just, with some of these things, they happen, and then, so what can you do after the fact? But there are, fines and that sort of things when there are issues.
Right, and the Clean Water Act is the other big lever there to work on the aquatic contamination. It looks like we have a question from online. Maybe we'll take that first.
First, I actually had just a comment from Erica Lovejoy of Sustainable Conservation, who says, kudos to Kaylee Allen and her colleagues for completing the statewide restoration programmatic biological opinion to help expedite approvals for multi-benefit floodplain restoration projects statewide. And she has more here, but she says it'll be important to use this tool along with notable new permitting tools to leverage funds and get more done sooner.
Can I just say thank you, Erica, and thank you to your team. We wouldn't have gotten through it without them. And I also meant to mention it earlier, and I forgot. So thank you for putting in the plug on that.
And then we had another viewer asks, we've heard the buzzwords of collaboration and consensus for decades with efforts like CalFed and the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, and today is no different. Drought and floods have always been a part of California's water landscape. What is different now, and how do we know that these aren't just words being thrown out for the sake of convenience?
Yeah, I think Jennifer has an answer to that.
I just think that there's much more awareness now. I think the fact that things have gotten extreme, the fact that we can go from full reservoirs to empty reservoirs to full reservoirs, and it's impossible to deny. I think a lot of water managers, we've been modeling this for a while. I mean, I did enjoy a lot of I told you so's this year, I have to say, but I think that people really are mobilizing because they have to now, and that is what has changed. I think a lot of things were more theoretical in previous planning processes, and we may have been trying to bite off a little bit too much maybe with CalFed, and maybe even with BDCP, but I think that there's a lot more clarity about what needs to be done, and the fact that we actually can't get anything done if we don't work together. I think that is more clear than it's ever been, and so the processes we're talking about today are real, and they're not just, again, theoretical or academic exercises. There are real systems being put into place to support that collaboration.
I also feel like we're facing challenges that feel existential now, whereas we didn't, back in the early days of CalFed. I mean, I think, we've all been touched by the wildfires and the whiplash we heard about earlier with the wet to dry cycles. And so it feels more real in a way, to me at least, than it did 20 years ago.
Thank you. Do we have another question in the room? Yes, back here in the back.
Okay. First off, totally appreciative of what you're doing and saying, and I feel real good about that. I do have a question, though. Back in Missouri, the number one issue for water there is sewage contamination from hog farms. Well, we don't have hog farms in California, but that Colby cheese I have at home comes from somewhere. And I'm just wondering, how are you able to address a huge issue somewhere else in this state?
Can you say the last part of the question again? The door
Just
cut it off.
Just waste from dairy industry, for example. How are you able to deal with that?
I wish you had asked the last panel that. When you had Laurel Firestone there, none of us are water quality regulators.
Oh, sorry, where? Okay, I hear there's a question in the back. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I was just kind of focusing on the voluntary agreements a little bit. I'm just kind of wondering what are the, why would agencies or contractors want to freely give up their water when, they work so hard to get that water and they want to sell? Like, why would they want to, give it up, I guess? Like, what are the incentives, I guess I'm wondering.
I think that's for you, Jennifer.
So, I mean, we are required to comply with a water quality control plan. It's currently Decision 1641. I think the board has rightly been clear that instead of the water quality control plan applying only to mostly junior water rights holders, that it would apply across the watershed. I think one thing we don't talk about a lot is that we've actually haven't done any science on delta outflow. There's a couple of regression analyses that might indicate something, but really we don't understand how the system needs outflow. We've spent 10 years studying entrainment. We absolutely know how to not entrain fish now. We're really, really good at that in the South Delta, but we haven't focused our dollars on this outflow. So from my perspective, and this may be different from a regulatory perspective or others, is that it's important that we actually start to test these hypotheses. It's important that we use our water resources and our science resources to actually get to the bottom of what mechanisms are driving some of these regressions, and do it in a way that I think is transparent, and we're working together with all the regulatory agencies, because having that answer, having those answers, for example, around entrainment, has allowed us to more efficiently operate the South Delta export facilities. We know when there's a risk to fish, and we know when there's not, and that's good for fish and for water supply. And it's the same sort of question we need to ask and answer around outflow. So that's a big part of my motivation. I've always said anyone who came into the VA room saying they knew what the outflow number is, I dismiss, because nobody knows what the number is. But we need to start somewhere, and what we have is a program with a substantial amount of water, 700,000 acre feet plus in the drier year conditions, that we can use to test that hypothesis along with all this habitat, which is really, I think, the most amount of acres we can humanly put in the ground in 8 years. That's what I think the program is. Combined with this governance and science is really, to me, where we need to start to get to this climate resilience, and to figure out from there what else we need to do. But we don't even have the base answer, and that's what motivates me to participate in the voluntary agreement.
So can I just add from the state perspective that if you take the strictly regulatory path through the State Water Resources Control Board, you don't get the scale of habitat that we hope we can produce and have built under the voluntary agreements, and you also spend years and years and years and millions of dollars on litigation and attorneys instead of improving conditions in the Bay Delta. And so that's what we're trying to get from the state perspective.
Great, thank you. Any other questions in the room or online? I'm sorry if I can't see you. The lights are really intense. Sarah, we're good?
There's always an online question.
We've got time for one more.
Okay, so I had a question here about how can we help smaller, less well-funded water districts that can't manage all the hurdles for applying for money and getting through permitting processes?
We're trying. We are trying. I don't have all the details off the top of my brain about all the different ways that DWR has tried to make the applying for grants and the getting of grants and the technical assistance, all of that, especially in this last drought. There was hundreds of millions of dollars that DWR got out the door for small communities for drought relief, and they did it as fairly efficiently compared to past processes. So I know we have a long way to go, but we are working on that. It's a priority.
I forgot to answer your earlier question about environmental justice, and the State Water Project is not, we don't serve water to a lot of valley communities, so it's not a direct thing that I work on or I'm supposed to work on, but I'm a native Californian, and I can't stand anymore that we have communities without safe drinking water, and it's an area that I've really picked up and tried to focus on, and I've been grateful that my members are also willing to look at creative solutions. So I think it is really challenging for these communities to figure out a solution. There are water rights holders, or those of us with access to water. We should be getting creative. We are trying to get creative to figure out how might we share in these excess flows. We can solve this problem. I think the solutions in my mind are actually very, very obvious, and what it's going to take is, again, that collaboration and a clear vision for how to do it. There are, in my mind, very obvious ways to take excess water from the State Water Project, for example, and provide that to safe drinking water communities and others that otherwise wouldn't have that water, in a way that then cost shares to, again, create resiliency for our water districts, provide water for safe drinking water communities, And I think it's just a matter of really sitting down and saying, who has water, who doesn't, who has money, who doesn't, who has storage, who doesn't, and putting those pieces together. And the dialogue needs to happen, and I think the answer's right there. And I don't think we should be relying on these communities that don't have this expertise and don't really know where to go to always come up with a solution. I think that is 100% on water rights holders' shoulders, and it's, technically not my professional business, but it's my business as a Californian, and I'll just say that, and I think it's all of our business.
Thank you so much. It's good to end on that can-do attitude. So don't move yet. That's the end of our panel. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. And I just want to give you a couple of announcements before we all go to lunch. And also, I need your help with something. So hang in there for just a second. So please remember to fill out the survey that you'll get by email. I really want to thank everyone who made this event possible. From our team at PPIC, the events team, our sponsors who helped make this all happen, our water policy team, our partners at the hotel, our panelists, and all of you in the audience. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to end with asking for your help with something to take a special moment to honor someone who's really the reason that this event happens and the reason that we're all here today. In fact, the Water Policy Center at PPIC would not exist without this woman. And so she's had a huge impact on water policy in California and done so much good for us all Californians. So please join me in standing up and giving a round of applause for Ellen Hannock. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Go have lunch. Go have a good networking lunch. It'll be in the lobby out here.
Yes.